Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Faced with the reality of a crashing economy, Americans wanted to go find a new deal. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have three objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to characterize the leadership style of Franklin Roosevelt. You should be able to summarize the major pieces of the New Deal, and you should be able to describe the conditions facing Western farmers in the mid-1930s. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 5. The 1932 election showed that Americans were clearly ready for some kind of a change. While Hoover had been previously considered a genius at about everything, his ham-fisted handling of the collapsing economy really left Americans not trusting his ability to lead. Because of the Depression, people were suffering from a real lack of food and work and hope. Although Republicans re-nominated Hoover for president as candidate, they also recognized that he had little chance of winning. Too many Americans were blaming Hoover for doing too little about the Depression, and they were ready for a new president. Subpoint B. Roosevelt's family. So Franklin Roosevelt is that person, maybe. His family had been in America since before the time of the Revolution. They were an established upper-crust family from Hyde Park in New York. Franklin Roosevelt was handsome, charming, and rich. He was also perpetually optimistic, although I'll tell you, it's a lot easier to be optimistic if you're handsome, charming, and rich. He spoke German and French. He was an accomplished sailor. He was a good golfer, a long hitter. He was an average student, albeit a Harvard man. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president, was his cousin, his fifth cousin, but his real cousin. And Franklin Roosevelt, he looked up to Teddy. He was his model and his hero. He even, wore the same kind of glasses for a while and picked up some of the TR mannerisms, things like saying delighted and bully for something that was going to be good. He hoped to follow his cousin's career path as an energetic and reformer president. At age 20, Franklin Roosevelt married Eleanor Roosevelt, his fifth cousin. So her maiden name is Roosevelt and her married name is Roosevelt. They were fifth cousins. It's not as weird as it sounds, I think. Anyway, with whom they had 6 kids. At some point, the Roosevelts fell out of love, and their marriage became more of a partnership, a business partnership and a political partnership. Roosevelt had an affair with Lucy Mercer, who was Eleanor's secretary. He was suspected of having a lot of affairs. Eleanor wrote that she could forgive Franklin, but she would never forget it. He considered divorce. But the Roosevelt family considered divorce to be an even worse scandal that would hurt the family name. And so their marriage continued, but certainly the quality of marriage changed. In 1921, he also became crippled due to polio. It was an infectious viral disease that caused muscle weakening and skeletal deformity and paralysis. He spent years trying to visit endless doctors and learning to exercise and doing anything he could ever do to walk again. He would never walk again. He did learn to kind of fake walk a little bit. When he was just standing, he was always standing. Basically, he could get into position. He could lock his legs together, sometimes wore like leg braces, and kind of like hold himself up into position. He never admitted to the public that he was crippled until just a couple of months before he died. Like Teddy Roosevelt, his cousin whom he adored, Franklin Roosevelt became Assistant Secretary of the Navy. At age 20, in 1920, at age 39, he was the Democratic nominee for Vice President in 1920. That year, the Democrats didn't win. They lost badly to Harding. In 1930, though, he was elected to Governor of New York. In 1932, he made the jump from Governor of New York to running for president. He looked incredibly energetic. He might have not been very clear on what he would do as president in 1932. He said that, the country demands bold and persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. It wasn't really clear what Franklin Roosevelt was going to do to manage the Great Depression, but it was clear that he was going to do something, which Herbert Hoover just kind of had the reputation as not doing much. Subpoint C. In 1932, Roosevelt promised a new deal for the American people, but his campaign was, like I said, pretty vague on how he was going to do that. As governor of New York, Franklin Roosevelt had proved to be an effective, reform-minded leader. He worked to combat the problems of unemployment and poverty. Unlike Hoover, Roosevelt had this can-do attitude. He projected an air of friendliness and confidence, and that was attractive to voters. Roosevelt won an overwhelming victory, and he captured 23 million votes to Hoover's 16 million votes. In the United States Senate, Democrats claimed nearly 2/3 of the majority. In the House, they won almost 3/4 of the seats. It was the greatest victory since the Civil War. Roosevelt's coattails were huge, and I think it also points to how big of a disaster Hoover was presiding over. Subpoint D. It's important also to remember that the Great Depression wasn't just an American depression. It was really a global crisis. Europe had been suffering throughout the 1920s. European countries trying to recover from the ravages of World War I faced huge war debts. In addition, Germany had those reparations payments, the unpayable payments, to compensate the Allies for damages that Germany had been accused of causing. The Great Depression compounded all of these problems by limiting America's ability to import European goods, which made it difficult to sell American farm products and manufactured goods abroad. The Smoot-Hawley tariff made everything even worse for Europeans, and of course it made it worse for Americans as well. U.S. economic problems rippled across the globe, and Europe faced its own Great Depression. Conservative and totalitarian leaders led Europe in the 1930s as people looked for answers from communism or fascism, or it looked like the old ways had fallen apart and people just needed some kind of a change. This is often what I talk about when I say how transformative World War I was, that it just seemed like the stuff that got us into war couldn't provide for a future out of it. On the other side of the Atlantic, Roosevelt saw his New Deal as an alternative to both socialism on the left or Nazism on the right, and it led to the inaction of upholders of unregulated capitalism, and it looked like this New Deal was, an American way forward. Roman numeral number, 6. 4 months elapsed between Roosevelt's election and his inauguration as president in March of 1933. The 20th Amendment to the Constitution would change that, would shorten the amount of time between the election and actual inauguration, but that wouldn't go into effect until basically the 1932 election, after the 32 election. So Roosevelt is elected, and then takes a long time before he can take into office. But he wasn't idle during that period. He worked with his team of very carefully picked advisors, a selected group of professors, of lawyers, of journalists, which he referred to as the Brain Trust. They were intellectuals and social workers that he gave important positions in his administration, and reflected Roosevelt's reform tradition of the progressive era. Take, for instance, the Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins. She was the longest-serving labor secretary, and she's also the first woman to be appointed to the cabinet. So first woman ever to get a cabinet-level position, Frances Perkins. She holds that job throughout, basically throughout her term. She's the longest-serving labor secretary, although she had like 4 terms to go do it in. She worked at Hull House. She worked for Jane Addams during the Progressive era, and had been an eyewitness to the Triangle Fire. Also, Harry Hopkins. Roosevelt appoints Harry Hopkins to head the emergency relief during Roosevelt's time as governor of New York. Then he served as a presidential advisor to Roosevelt. Also, Justice Louis Brandeis offered political advice from the Supreme Court. We don't usually expect a Supreme Court justice to offer political advice. We kind of expect Supreme Court to go stay apolitical, but Brandeis was an important voice in the Roosevelt administration. Upon taking office, the Roosevelt administration launched a period of intense activity known as the 100 Days. It lasted from March 9th to June 16th of 1933. During this period, Congress passed more than 15 major pieces of New Deal legislation. The laws and the others that followed significantly expanded the federal government's role in the nation's economy. Subpoint B. Roosevelt actually spent most of that first year of office in 1933 trying to just reassure the public. A lot of banks were pretty unhealthy banks. Their businesses were not good businesses. From late 1929 to 1933, on average, a bank was closing a week. Now, banks rarely close today. Our banking system is incredibly stable, but a bank a week is kind of a free fall for American banking. And when they closed, they lost the money of all of their depositors. They were bankrupt. There was no money left to get. Deposits weren't insured, and in this atmosphere, banks might not lend to each other because it always looked like the Wild West of banking. President Roosevelt, when he takes office, declares a bank holiday, basically saying, okay, all the banks are closing. we're going to take some time off, go figure out which ones are working and which ones aren't working. The Emergency Banking and Relief Act. This is, strictly speaking, not actually a constitutional power of the president, but he ordered it and people went with it. So it became a constitutional power of the president. Basically, while they were in this bank holiday, they closed all the banks until we could sort out which ones were solvent, which ones were going concerns, which ones were not, and then let the good banks open along the way. On March 12th, the day before the first banks were to reopen, President Roosevelt gave the first of his many what he called fireside chats. Fireside chats were radio talks. They were held from the White House. It might have actually been by a fire. They might, maybe people listened to it in their own house by the fireplace. It was the radio. You didn't know where you were sitting. But they called it the fireside chats. And in these, he tried to explain basically like public concern. And in the first one, he made it clear, simple language about how his New Deal measures were carried out. They were informal talks that made Americans feel as if the president was talking directly to them. In his first of the fireside chats, Roosevelt explained why the nation's welfare depended on the public support of government and the banking system. He says, "We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system. It is up to you to support it and make it work." And then he explained how banking worked to listeners that really weren't that savvy on how the economy operated. The president explained to people that when you demand your savings in cash, then banks would fail. A bank could go and pay one person their savings, or maybe even a few. But if everybody suddenly had a panic of the bank and ran and demanded all of their money back at once, there just wasn't going to be enough money to go around because banks didn't keep that cash on hand. They loaned it out to other people along the way. But if everybody demanded it at once, there was a panic and the bank would fail. This wasn't because the banks were weak. In fact, most of the banks were fine. But you could make them weak by causing a panic. And even strong banks couldn't meet those kind of demands. Over the next few weeks, Americans slowly started returning their savings to the banks as they reopened. Roosevelt also introduced the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which was an insurance program for banks. It says that if the bank goes broke, depositors can still get their money back, up to $2,500 at the time. It would later be $250,000 like it is today. But you also wanted to just, in general, bring stability to the banking system. Subpoint C. The centerpiece of Roosevelt's plan for combating the Depression was the National Industrial Recovery Act. It created an administration to go establish rules, to go regulate cutthroat competition, and to promote fair business practices. The NIRA had a few goals: to help workers by setting a minimum wage, to set maximum weekly hours, and to not let products be sold for less than minimum values, minimum prices on it. And he put retired General Hugh Johnson to go in charge of it, to go set standard for production and prices and wages in the textile industry and the steel business and mining and auto industries. He launched a publicity campaign for businesses that cooperated with the NRA to the National Recovery Administration, is the NRA, not the Rifle Association. It was basically a relief program for businesses. And they said, if you cooperate, you get to put a logo on it, the Blue Eagle logo. Its purpose, he said, was to end destructive competition, but large corporations ended up dominating the code writing process, allowing them to actually drive up their prices, stress competition, and maybe even bankrupt their competitors. The Supreme Court looked at the NRA in 1935 and unanimously killed it. Says this is not a constitutional provision. Said the president had taken too much power for himself, and this is just not how constitutional provisions work. The policies would later reappear in other acts as Roosevelt would try to find constitutional ways to carry out these policies. Politically, the NRA created and favored unions. It became part of the New Deal coalition that lasted for another 30 years. More about that later. Subpoint D. The 100 Days also brought the government into providing direct relief. Things like the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, which made grants to local agencies who would go help the poor. Basically, if there was some local charity trying to help poor people, the federal government could give federal cash to go make that happen better. Also the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which set unemployed young men to work on projects like forest preservation or flood control and the improvement of national parks and wildlife preserves. Also a number of public works projects, and these are probably some of the most enduring pieces of the New Deal. Things like the PWA, the Public Works Administration, which built roads and bridges and highways and schools and hospitals and public facilities. Also the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built a series of dangets along the Tennessee River and other various tributary rivers to go prevent floods and also deforestation along the Tennessee River. Also, those dangets would provide cheap electrical power for homes and factories in regions where a lot of people just were living without electricity and non-electrified log cabins. Subpoint E. Also, by the way, history teachers often talk about the alphabet soup of the New Deal. I think you're getting a piece of it here. Subpoint E, the AAA, which is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which sought to raise crop prices by lowering certain production. Basically, the government tried to pay farmers to leave some amount of their farm unfarmed. Basically, like, you're just planting too much crops, and that's creating too much supply. And the market just doesn't have the demand which could keep that supply. So farmers, I know you want to make more money. Let's just not plant this stuff right now, and then we'll just give you some cash to not plant it, and got farmers into the not farming business. To give us some money for leaving some acres of land unseeded. The theory was that reduced supply would boost prices, and that would go improve the agricultural sector. In some cases, this was not possible to do. The farmers had already planted the crops, and it was too far advanced to go to use the acreage reduction effect. So as a result, the government paid cotton growers $200 million to plow under their crop, just basically go destroy the cotton crop. It also paid hog farmers to go slaughter 6 million pigs, just to say, like, maybe we should just reduce the supply. And I know you got pigs ready to get to market. Let's just kill and bleed out the pigs and not take it to market. This policy was pretty upsetting to Americans. The Americans that were living in cities are like, hey, we're in a Great Depression here. We're having a hard time finding food, and you're just on purpose destroying food. How about you just give it to us instead, and we'll eat the hogs? They protested the direction of food when a lot of people were going hungry. It did, however, raise some farm prices, and it put a lot of money in farmers' put a lot of money in farmers' pockets. The AIA succeeded in significantly raising farm prices and incomes for large farmers, but it did hurt small-time farmers and tenant farmers. Subpoint F. Housing. During the Roaring 20s, home ownership became like the promise of the future. It was the American dream. And home ownership became a mark of respectability as well. But the Great Depression devastated the housing industry. The Hoover administration had established federally sponsored bank loans to go issue loans. But Roosevelt established the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, to go stimulate new housing construction. There were other important measures of Roosevelt's first years of office. The 21st Amendment was passed, which would go repeal prohibition. Also, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to go regulate the telephone and radio industries. And the SEC, boy, so many letters, the Security and Exchange Commission, to go regulate the stock and bond markets. Roman numeral number next. Here are farmers really take it the hardest. Well, they're trying to see some recovery in the prices of crops going up. In 1934, a severe drought hit the middle America, the Great Plains, an area known as the Dust Bowl, and it ruined agriculture in Oklahoma, in Texas, in Kansas, and in Colorado. During the previous decade, farmers from Texas and North Dakota had used tractors to go break up the grasslands and go plant millions of acres of farmland. But doing so, the plowing had removed the thick protective layer of the prairie grasses, and modern farming just did not understand the value of topsoil very well. Farmers then exhausted the land through overproduction of crops, and the grasslands became unsuitable for farming. Crop rotation was a known practice, but it just thought like, man, this soil is so good, let's run it. When the drought came and the winds began in the early 1930s, the very little grass and the very few trees of the prairie were left to hold down the soil, and the wind just picked it up and scattered it away. And subpoint B, that exposed the sand and the grit underneath, which was very unsuitable land for farming in. The dust then, that topsoil, was blowing across the plains for hundreds of miles. One windstorm in 1934 blew millions of tons of dust from the plains all the way to the East Coast. The region that was hardest hit, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, became known as the Dust Bowl. Plagued by dust storms and evictions, thousands of farmers and sharecroppers just left. They just left their farms and land behind. They packed up their families and the few belongings. They headed west, following Route 66 to California. John Steinbeck, the American author John Steinbeck, one of the most famous authors and for my money, the best in American literature. He wrote about the Dust Bowl in his epic novel, The Grapes of Wrath in 1939, about the fictional Joad family and their trek to California for better life. The Grapes of Wrath was also an Oscar-winning film, and it was a critical and popular sensation in its day. Just Americans could so identify with the Joad family and the trials that they went through. Some of these migrants, like the Joads, but the real life ones, known as Okies, a term that officially, originally referred to Oklahomans, but eventually just became negatively used for all immigrants. I mean, nobody wants to be from Oklahoma, right? They're to people who moved west to go find work as farmhands. Others just continued to wander in search of whatever work they could find. By the end of the 1930s, hundreds of thousands of farm families had migrated to California and other Pacific Coast states, trying to find some promise for the future. The Great Depression hit hard. The New Deal did whatever they could to address the issues, but it just seemed like things kept getting worse. That story of addressing challenges of the day and how to approach a changing economy, a changing culture, a changing world is the story of American history, and it's a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.